everyone, I'm Hugo.
And I'm Jake.
And this is the Bible Reloaded.
Woo.
Today we're doing yet another review, and this one is...
This is probably the most famous Christian film of all time.
I guess I could see that and probably the Ten Commandments.
Maybe 10 Commandments, yeah.
But
I think this got far more fanfare, at least. Because
it
was more modern.
It had controversy, I know that.
For sure.
Today we're looking at Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ.
Sadly, Mel Gibson will not be making an appearance.
That's unfortunate. But this is based upon the last 12 hours of the life of Jesus, and it has several sources. You might assume that, hey, this is just based on the Bible story. Yes and no. Well, a lot of the stuff definitely comes from the Gospels. A large part of The Passion is based upon the works of Anne Catherine Emmerich. She was a nun who had visions and said that this is what happened when Jesus died.
Very Joe Smith.
Yeah, she had these vivid stories of the specifics of Jesus' death.
Right.
And she had this other guy come and meet with her, and he wrote them down and put them into a book. And this book was known as
The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, which is pretty much just the chronicles of the last 12 hours of his life and all the beatings, and it goes into far greater detail as to the savagery that the Romans committed onto Jesus. It seems very fanficky, and certainly extra.
Yeah.
And a little gratuitous. But yeah, so this is the film adaptation of that, and Mel Gibson. First impressions, well shot film. Very well shot film. I think it's a technically sound film. It's easily the best, I think, filmed movie that we've watched. That's not a documentary.
I agree.
And I think, for all intents, Jim Caviezel did a fantastic job in the role. It was convincing. He did great. As a film, I think it's an alright film. I think it's a good film. And by the way, Caviezel, staunch Catholic, as is Mel Gibson. So, yeah. I mean, you can really see that it means a lot to him to nail this role. And he does a great job.
Watching this movie, it's definitely the Catholic version of the story because they put heavy emphasis on Mary as sort of divine and all that stuff. Also, I'd like to say my problems with this film are not technical in nature, like Jake said. I think it's well put together as far as how it's shot, and even the screenplay is fine.
Oh yeah,
it's just I disagree with the mission. It seems like this movie set out to have.
I disagree with the mission itself as well.
But we will talk about that in the body of the review. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start with our review of the critically acclaimed and bashed Passion of the Christ. The movie begins, and I'm starting to see a trend with these Christian films.
Yeah.
Always starts with a quote. Even if it's not in the Bible, always a quote. But this one happens to be a Bible quote.
Apparently it's more striking. It's like when people in speech writing classes can't figure out a real attention getter. They're just like, I don't know, what did Martin Luther King Jr. say? He had a dream. I had a dream. And then you hit your thesis. Well, this is kind of like that. And he opens up with Isaiah 53, just in general, but we found the verse.
And that verse says, He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. By his wounds we are healed.
That sounds very Jesus-y. But if you don't know, we also do a Bible study on this channel. However you came across this, maybe you know that already. But if not, we do a Bible study. That is an Old Testament thing, not a New Testament thing. So it's peculiar. Why would Jesus be in the Old Testament?
Well, that's the short answer is he's not. The longer answer is that in this particular part of Isaiah, Christians often like to say that it's a prophecy, and they try and use it to justify the belief that Jesus is the Messiah foretold.
Yeah.
However, if you're Jewish, you happen to know that in this part of Isaiah, they're talking about the suffering servant, and the suffering servant, if you're Christian, as we said, you think is Jesus. However, if you're anything but that, it's usually thought to refer to Israel as a nation.
It's mostly interpreted as far as a Torah reading and an Old Testament reading, which it would have been at the time, as an Israel parable.
Yeah, it's metaphorical. Yeah. So the movie about Jesus opens with a quote that for most people who aren't Christian, not about Jesus. But I get it. It is what it is.
Yeah.
We begin in the Garden of Gethsemane, and if you're not familiar with the story of Jesus and how he died, which that's basically what this movie is, Jesus goes to this garden right before he's captured by the Romans, and he goes to pray. And interestingly, when he goes to pray, it seems like in part he's trying to get God to not go through with the crucifixion.
So interesting. I always have a weird issue with the idea of the Jesus sacrifice, just in general. First problem I have with it is just it's such an analog way to get across forgiveness. When you're an omnipotent being, you should be able to forgive. That aside, he should want to die if this is the only way to do it. And while I get like, oh, it hurts and that would be terrible, and would you do that? Well, no, but he clearly knows without a shadow of a doubt that he will be king when he dies and all that. But even still, you have this weird doubt thing, and then later on in the film we'll get some more lines, and they're also biblical, that it seems contradictory to want that.
It comes down to the problem of the Trinity and who Jesus is, and the Garden of Gethsemane is often used by theologians to try and talk about the Trinity because, as we're talking about, it kind of presents an interesting problem.
Yeah.
It's often used to basically say, this proves, air quotes, that Jesus is both wholly human and wholly divine, is what I've heard them say, which is basically, in my mind, a way to say, we don't know what the fuck this means either, so,
Yeah.
I don't know, he's both. But I that's basically the theological perspective on that.
Yeah. But that aside, there's really cool shots with the movie's version of Satan, which I think is probably the most interesting one outside of, like, Constantine, where he's just kind of this loudmouth guy. This one's, like, creepy, and he doesn't have eyebrows, and he's kind of androgynous. He's really pale skinned, he's just kind of quiet, doesn't have any lines. Very cool.
This version of Satan is very good in this movie. Not in the Bible, by the way, in this scene. But I do like that Gibson, or the screenwriter, I don't know who put it in there specifically,
Right.
basically is using that to visually show the conflict and the doubt.
It's nice to have that sort of filmmaking, because we're so used to watching these shitty films, that he didn't need exposition to say, I am internally conflicted. You have this nice scene. And so for the rest of this film, it's easy to watch for the most part. So I like the screenplay and the flow and the shots and all that. It's very good storytelling.
At this point, you're also probably going to notice, hey, they're not speaking in English, which I commended this movie for. This movie at least attempts to be a little bit period accurate. And I say a little bit because there are some inaccuracies. The thing they got correct is the people, Jesus' apostles and the people from the area are speaking Aramaic, which apparently is period correct. The Romans, and if you don't know, the Romans were occupying Judea at the time.
They had probably occupied it, depending on the date you set for Jesus' death, anywhere from 1 to about 4 years total they had been in control, and Judea no longer had independence. And this is kind of a tumultuous time for Judea historically, if the time is correct. And then they'll have a revolt like 50 years later.
But in the movie, they have them speaking Latin. And don't get me wrong, those people may have known Latin, and certainly people closer to where they're from would have spoken Latin. However, in this area, they probably would have spoken Greek, because in the movie, they have either the Jewish people speaking Aramaic and the Romans speaking Latin, and then if they talk to each other, one will switch to the other. However, typically what would happen is the common language between the two would be Greek, so there's no Greek in the movie.
Which, it's a nitpick.
I know, it's a nitpick.
I just thought it was interesting.
I commend them for not doing it in English. The vast majority of the movie is in Aramaic, or if not, it's Latin.
Most of these movies, what happens is they'll just be like, we'll put on an English accent, and this means we're foreign.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. Hollywood.
Yeah, so that's one thing that's really awesome about the film. I would say, though, one scene that's interesting is Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate, which we'll get to later, but in this scene, Jesus speaks to Pontius Pilate in Latin, which Jake and I were talking about this earlier. Interesting that Jesus would be talking to him in Latin because...
Assume they even meant Greek.
Yeah.
It'd still be weird.
Jesus probably wouldn't have known... Jesus wouldn't have known Latin.
Probably.
He may have known Greek, but...
It's just interesting that that would be a conversation that they would have, and he wouldn't have spoken Aramaic.
Yeah.
Because I would assume they would have prepped the governor of an area that he had to rule to know the language.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. I don't know how accurate that would have been, anyways, but I just thought it was cool.
So we cut to Judas and the Pharisees, and if you don't know, the Pharisees were sort of the...
Jew kingpins?
The Jew kingpins, sure.
Yeah.
They were the head of the Jewish church in the area at the time, and they're against Jesus within the context of the story. Might I add, problems we have with the movie as far as story-wise, assume we have those same problems with the story in the Bible.
Because that's factual. That's how we feel about it.
Yeah.
Anything that's wrong with the film, as far as arguments, is also wrong in the Bible, in our opinion, because they're pretty true to the stories that they get from this and from the Dolores Passion.
But anyway, Judas is selling out Jesus to the Pharisees because they don't like that he's stirring up stuff in the area, and he's obviously saying he's the Messiah, which they don't like because they don't think he is.
Right.
So the Pharisees come in with soldiers. Now this is one of the more glaring inaccuracies in the movie, because they have these people in uniforms appearing to be some sort of regiment, and you might assume, if you didn't really know anything about the period or the Bible and what it says about this, you might assume these are somehow Jewish forces, Jewish...
They wouldn't have forces.
No, in the Bible, all it says is Judas comes with a group of men with clubs and swords, which, based on the context, you'd assume it's just a mob gotten together
thuggish sort of
by the Pharisees. However, here it makes it seem as though the Jews in the area had a standing army. However,
like they could mobilize.
Roman occupation, the Romans would not have allowed them to have a standing army, because that would allow them to rebel. Wouldn't have happened. And this kind of falls into the category of, it's not that big of a deal. However, some people who seem to claim that this movie is anti-Semitic, you could look at this and you could say they're trying to make it seem like all the Jews were kind of together and in agreement that Jesus was a problem and they all had him killed, even though really it's more complicated than that. When you get into the anti-Semitism in this and in Passion plays in general, it kind of ignores the fact that the Jews were in disagreement about a lot of things at the time, and they weren't just one solid body, especially because of the Roman occupation. It caused a lot of splits, so there were lots of people, the Pharisees, probably very traditional still. However, you probably had some people saying, hey, Romans occupying us, maybe we need to kind of evolve our beliefs and evolve our system.
And even during that time, when the Romans come, throughout that area, anytime, just even in several Jewish settlements, you get different people claiming they're Messiah.
Right.
It happens. It makes sense, too.
Yeah.
Especially if you believe it. And frankly, if you watch this through a non-religious lens and you watch the performance Caviezel gives and the words Jesus says, he comes across as a crazy person.
Yeah.
Legit.
Like a crazy person I feel sorry for, but a crazy
absolutely.
person.
You feel sympathy for the character throughout the film.
Yeah. I just don't think he's divine.
He totally comes across as like a schizophrenic guy who dies by police fire just because he thinks he's something he's not or thinks things are happening. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, these soldiers, Jewish, whatever you want to call them, they appear and they say, we're looking for Jesus. So Judas comes over, kisses Jesus, and this was his signal to the mob that, hey, this is who you capture. They come and capture Jesus. The disciples kind of freak the fuck out, cut a dude's ear off.
Oh, totally cut his ear off.
And I get that this has to expand upon things, because certainly it's a movie, I get it, but it's just interesting that they decided to go with slow-mo fight scene. When I first saw this, my thought was, this reminds me a little bit of 300.
Yeah, it was they do a lot of the slow-mo stuff throughout the film. Like Jesus will be on the cross and they'll flip him a little bit and it'll be like... but it's a stylistic choice, and I think it was a little overblown. You can tell it was an early 2000s movie because of the style.
It has that editing.
Oh, definitely. Sure. But the only thing it did was extend the movie by about a half hour total.
Yeah. But Jesus tells his people, hey, calm down. Those who live by the sword die by the sword, which is a quote, and I think all 4 Gospels have that specific quote. So that's one of those things that they think he definitely said. Okay. Anyway, he then takes the ear of the guy that got it cut off, reattaches it, because Jesus. That's a cool thing of him to do, I guess. Yeah. Too bad he gets killed. But they do capture him, and they take him, and they beat the living shit out of him.
For 2 minutes, like, straight.
And here's the problem with the movie. This movie is a story about Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm an atheist, so I don't think Jesus is divine. However, I will say that I think there probably was a historical Jesus. There was a guy named Yeshua, who was probably a teacher, a religious teacher with ideas. And what's written in the Bible, take out all the miracles and stuff, a lot of the things Jesus says, cool stuff.
Golden rule. Nailed it.
Give money to the poor. Money isn't the only thing. Hey, don't be a dick. Those things are good. I think you can make a really solid movie about Jesus, and I won't necessarily agree with the whole he's the son of God thing.
But get the message across.
But the important thing should be the message of compassion.
The message in this instead is, look how much they kicked the shit out of him.
This movie is 80% Jesus getting the shit kicked out of him.
Yeah.
I'm not even kidding. If I didn't know better, I'd say people who really did not like Jesus made this movie, because they just beat the fuck out of him.
It's an appeal to guilt.
It really is.
That's all it is.
But yeah, it begins here and it just doesn't stop for like 90 minutes. Anyway, one of the interesting things that happens here that definitely comes from the Passion of the Christ book that we talked about earlier. He's chained up and they knock him over this ledge and he like stops short, so like the chains tighten around his midsection. It's awful. It's just awful.
It just seems gratuitous.
It's way gratuitous.
All the time.
So they take him to the Pharisees, and at the same time Roman forces, because as I said they're occupying, kind of come over and they go, what's happening? And one of the people says to them, they arrested Jesus of Nazareth. And they're like, oh, that's weird. We better go tell Pilate. And this is the first inclination that there's going to be some issues and some political problems from this, but we'll get to that when we get to that.
Flashback to Jesus. He's a carpenter. Look at his eyes. Look how striking those eyes are. And then he makes a really tall table and then pretends he invented chairs to his mom.
This is one of the weirdest scenes in the movie,
It's
but
so
I love
weird.
this scene.
And she says the words, "That'll never catch on." Like, Jesus is weird for thinking chairs.
I know it's comic relief. It's like but the weird thing is it's like the only comic relief in the movie.
And there's no precedent anywhere besides this point.
Yeah, she's like, why is that table so tall?
Like, you could have easily had more flashbacks where you have Jesus in life and made up some tiny scenes to establish, like, love for mother and son, and that's totally fine. And they have, like, little cute moments like that, and it would have been cool. But since this is the only one, it's like, really? Chairs?
They're just trying to teach us that Jesus was an early adopter of the chair.
He's a fucking pioneer, man.
We get to I guess I'll call it a trial, but it's more like a tribunal where Jesus is there and he's being judged by the Pharisees, and they talk to him. They're very condescending because this movie wants to demonize them as much as possible, but then again, so does the Bible, so I get it. They ask him, hey, are you the son of God? And he pretty plainly says, yeah. And they beat the fuck out of him again because you can't go 5 minutes without it. It's like the story could stand without the beating. Even in the Bible, the beating scenes are literally one line. Don't get me wrong, the story itself in the Bible, regardless of what gospel you're looking at, isn't that long. It's like a page and a half at longest. But it just says he got beat or they flogged him, which I get. It's not a visual medium, and this is. But proportionality is pretty important. And if you feel the most important part of your story is Jesus getting his shit kicked in, you're fucked up. Why did you make that movie? Why did you make this? Anyway.
So after Jesus says, I'm king, the head priest guy from the Pharisees rips his shirt. He's like, nah, can you believe this shit? I ruined my shirt because of what he just said. Did you see how ruined this shirt is now? And so you know it's for real. You know how mad they are.
It's so interesting because if you watch our atheist Bible study videos, you know in the Bible it continually says people like rip their clothes out of like anger
it's usually
or bereavement.
A grief. And this guy, he's just like
he can't handle it. He's like rips his shirt like fucking Fabio. Good for him.
It's like he got halfway and is like, I could probably fix this. Never mind.
Then we get a scene with Judas, who now regrets selling out Jesus because he didn't realize all the consequences. He thought maybe they would punish him, but they didn't realize, they're going to try and kill him. So he goes to the Pharisees and it's like, I want to give back these 30 pieces of silver, because Jesus was worth 30 pieces of silver, apparently.
Definitely.
Not bad. And he's like, I want to give it back. And they're like, no. He throws it at him. And this is interesting because there are actually two versions of what happens to Judas in the Bible. One of them, he throws the coins at them, and then they use the coins to buy a plot of land, and then Judas kills himself. There's a second version, though, where Judas keeps the coins, buys himself a plot of land, and I think then he kills himself.
But I guess there's also a third version as far as the movie and the Dolores Passion is concerned, where Judas throws the coins, runs away, gets chased by demon children, finds a tree, and then hangs himself with a rope that was tied around a dead donkey. Well, I guess whichever one you want.
Now we have Jesus, and he's being brought before the Roman officials, Pontius Pilate, and all the people in the palace. And the Pharisees are there, and it's the rabble. And they say to him, hey, this guy's a criminal. He was working on the Sabbath, and he's trying to, kick up a rebellion, and he says he's the Messiah, which, historical context, this is one of those things in the Bible that people like to demonize Pontius Pilate, hard, as if he, had malice. And I'd like to point out a couple things. As we said, Rome is occupying Judea at the time.
Yep.
They can't really afford to have uprisings all the time because that's a pain in the ass to handle. So if they're being told that Jesus is trying to kick up shit, they're going to try and put a stop to it. Not only that, but as you know, the Last Supper happens right before this.
Right.
The Last Supper is a Passover meal. Passover is happening, so more people are in town than usual. Shit's already crazy in this town right now.
Yeah.
And they probably already have more stuff than they can really handle trying to keep the local population in check. They really don't need another person stirring up the population. So I'm not saying, assuming that this did happen and assuming that someone named Pontius Pilate had someone named Yeshua, Jesus, killed. I'm not saying that's right. But don't just assume, because it's in the Bible, don't assume he's like an evil person trying to do an evil thing. He's trying to do his job.
Right. And I don't think they paint him necessarily evil in the movie. Totally. I think they paint him more as like reluctant murderer.
Yeah.
But they definitely don't give him a total pass, which is interesting. When really, although they definitely give the Jews a much harder, we'll call it accusation, than it is. But this brings up a weird point for me. At this point, you're playing the blame game. Whose fault is it? Who's treating Jesus the worst? Like, the Jews send him to the Romans, and the Romans will end up in a very short amount of time from now. They will be kicking the shit out of him for an hour. And you're supposed to feel bad. You're supposed to be like, damn it, why'd they do this to Jesus? Christian viewer, pretend like I'm turning to camera B. Okay, we're there now. Why is it bad that Jesus died? You need it. You need it. Otherwise, you don't have any sort of salvation. This story should be a happy story. Every time he gets hit, you should be like, fuck yeah! Good for you, Jesus, taking another one for the team. And when he dies, you should be like, thanks, Jesus, you're a great guy. You shouldn't be like, fuck you, Jews and Romans, you're bad. Actually, they're like when a point guard passes the ball and then the guy dunks it. Jesus is the ball, and then like the Romans and the nails were the dunk, and then the Jews were the point guard. Do you get it? They're just assists. Like they're all part of the same team. This is good for you. End rant.
So Pilate goes and talks to Jesus. And this is the scene that we were talking about where Jesus speaks Latin, which is weird, but we talked about it already. And Pilate's like, are you accused of this? Blah, 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 blah. And Jesus is like, maybe. And here's one of my problems with the movie. And again, like we said, this is in the Bible too. Yeah. Jesus doesn't put up any defense. It's not like he's like, I'm Jesus, don't do this. He's like, do it, whatever, I'm Jesus. But again, you can't really be mad at the Romans for crucifying him, because he's like, fuck it, do it, fucking do it, basically.
Yeah, dare you, but you won't. Yeah, we will. And Pilate gives him outs. He's like, we don't have to do this. You just say you're not. Or just, you don't have to kick up shit anymore. And she's like, probably gonna kick up shit. You're a fucker. I hate you. Nah. And so that happens. And then even after that, like, Pontius is gonna be like, hey, here's Barabbas. Can I kill him instead? He's a really bad guy. And they're like, no, I don't like Jesus.
But before the whole Barabbas thing, Pontius Pilate's like, this isn't my business, take him to Herod. And Herod, if Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor of the area, Herod would be the more
like the mayor.
Local ruler, let's say.
They're both order keepers, but he was put into place by the Romans. And every time you see Herod in anything, he's always a fop. And he's always like giggly and like, we do drugs and have a lot of sex here. I'm Herod.
Yeah, that's always funny. I always like that. I don't know why. It's just
his
funny.
hair's always cool.
Yeah. But the Herod scene, the most important thing that happens is Jesus is again obstinate, and all Herod wants, and again, in the Bible, by the way, not all the versions of this have Herod in it, but the ones that do, and it may only be one, it's either one or two versions even have Herod. He just says, it says specifically, Herod had been hearing about Jesus, he wanted to see him, and Herod says to him, show me a miracle, like I want proof that you're the Son of God. And Jesus flat out refuses to do anything. Now, if you're Christian, you would say, well, he doesn't have to prove anything.
It's a noble, like a I'm a better man situation.
Or you might say, well, he didn't because he knew he had to be killed. However, my response to that would be, that's a very convenient excuse for someone who can't perform a miracle at the moment.
I don't know.
It's one of those things where you're making a claim that he could perform a miracle but is choosing not to because he wants to die. That's a non-falsifiable claim, so it's not a claim worth evaluating, in my opinion. And
he'll do it again on the cross.
Yeah.
And he does it one other time. I think someone is like, well, why don't you bring out down an army of angels? He's like, I could, but I'm not gonna.
In any scene where Jesus is in peril and he dies, and they claim that he could do something but doesn't, there are two options. Either he could do something and doesn't,
because he's selfless,
or he doesn't do something because he can't, because he doesn't have magic powers. Assuming in this situation those two things are indistinguishable from each other from an outsider perspective, which one is more likely? He's selfless and magic, or just isn't magic? Never seen magic powers in the world, so I'm gonna say not magical. But anyway, Herod just gets sick of looking at him because he refuses to respond to him and stuff, because Jesus is being very stoic. Also, he was beat a lot, so maybe brain damage.
He was a little concussed.
And they send him back to Pontius Pilate.
So Pontius is like, okay, I'm going to do the Barabbas thing now. Hey, Jews. And they're like, yeah. And he's like, do you want me to kill him? And they're like, yeah. And then he's like, what about Barabbas? They're like, no. And he's like, are you sure? He's a murderer. Or in other versions of the Bible, he's a leader of an uprising. And the Jews are like, no. And he's like, so Jesus? And they're like, yeah. Thanks, Jews. So Barabbas is just this guy who gets pardoned instead. He's either, according to different versions of the Bible, he's either a murderer or the guy who's trying to create an uprising and fight back the Romans, which that makes more sense, actually.
Yeah, they always make Barabbas seem like the biggest douche in the world. In the movie, he looks like a crazy fucker.
Oh, yeah.
Like, insane. But again, in the Bible, some of the versions just say he's a person who is part of an uprising, assuming against the Romans, which is weird that the Romans would let that guy go. But
right, but even so, it would make more sense that the Jews would want the guy who's creating the uprising to stay more than the guy who's fragmenting them. Does that make sense? So if Barabbas was a rebel leader and Jesus was this guy who claimed to be the Messiah and had a small following, if they had the choice between the two, yeah, they're going to pick Barabbas every time. If it's a murderer between Jesus, I don't know, but it seems like blasphemy is worse than murder in almost all cases in the Bible anyway, so.
Yeah.
And calling yourself the king of the Jews is blasphemy.
Yeah. So they let Barabbas go, and then the crowd basically cries out to crucify him. This is one of the parts of the Bible and the movie which I always find interesting, because if Jesus had so many followers, as the Bible seems to imply he did,
where fuck are they?
Where are his followers?
There's not even one person in the crowd that's like, no. There's several people in the crowd being quiet, and those are his mother, Mary Magdalene as well, and then there's, I think, Peter. And so there's like 3 of his friends there. But other than that, does he have like no other following? He's been pretty famous, relatively, enough to make the Pharisees hate his face. So why isn't there any like debate about this?
Yeah, because in the same town, when he came to town, he rode in on the donkey. Again, according to the Bible, he rides in on the donkey and they have the palm leaves. So those are followers. Where are those followers when he needs them?
It doesn't make any sense.
It kind of serves to establish that it seems like Mel Gibson is sort of trying to demonize the establishment.
Also, the Bible
Jews.
does a very similar thing where that no one really stands up for him. And it just seems very narrative driven. Like, he had followers and then none. Yeah. No one would stand up for the Son of God. Don't you feel like a piece of shit? He died for you, you cunts.
So Pilate tries one more thing. He's like, I'm not going to have him killed. I'll have him beaten instead. And everyone's like, aw, just beaten. So they drag him off to this post, and there seems to be a Roman official there who has a book he's writing down. What numbers does he have to write down? He's the head of the beating area.
He's just doodling. He's like, look at this Jew. He's totally getting his shit kicked in. And so at first they flog him and they hit him with like these bendy wooden sticks, and it looks like it hurts. And the effects on the beatings, they do a fantastic job. You see the sticks hit and it causes a bruise right away. I can't imagine Jim Caviezel actually took a real beating. So they did a really good job with the effects. And then they're like, this isn't good enough. We gotta flagellate him. If you don't know what flagellation is, here's a picture of the flagellation tool. Look at that thing. That would be unpleasant. And then the dude hits it into a desk and pulls wood up to establish that this is the most fucked up weapon you could possibly use on someone tied to a stump, and then they proceed to use them. I get it, but it's so you could have shown me 2 minutes of this and been like, okay, totally fine. But instead it goes on for like 15 minutes.
This is one of the biggest scenes in the movie. It's a set piece. This is like the famous imagery from the movie is him being chained to this post and beaten with this tool. And while we sat there for 15 minutes watching Jim Caviezel, sexy Jim Caviezel, be covered in his own blood, it occurred to me that this movie reminds me of the movie Twins. In the movie Twins, you have Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, who are twins who were genetically created because Arnold Schwarzenegger was created to be the super perfect being, and he has all the good stuff. And all the crap that would have been him, but they took out all the crap, came out, and it was Danny DeVito. Yeah. This movie is the Danny DeVito of Christianity. It takes out any redeeming factors, and it's just all the crap. It's the persecution complex. It's the violent imagery. It's the demonization of Jews and Romans and all that crap.
It's the savagery allowed by God himself.
It's all the bad parts of Christianity distilled.
Oh, yeah. And then, anytime you get even a glimpse, because there's a few times they cut away and they show some Jesus stuff. And they'll show, like, the first one is toddler Jesus. He trips on a rock and his knee hurts. His deified knee is in pain from obviously kryptonite rock or something that hurts gods. And then his mom walks over and is like, "Oh, baby Jesus, you're hurt." And then it cuts. And you're back to flagellation. Why can't we get some character building? Why can't we get another scene later? Jesus will be helping Mary Magdalene as she's walking out of the place watching him get beaten. And you see this moment where she was, and if you don't know who Mary Magdalene is, she was a prostitute, and then she starts hanging out with Jesus, and she's basically saved. You just see the moment where he walks into town and she kind of crawls towards him, touches his foot, and then they look at each other. And you could have had a moment there where he's like, "You don't have to be a prostitute, lady. You could just like hang out with me and no one will want to give you a dicking." And she's like, "All right, that sounds great." But nothing. You just get back to flagellation. Like anytime you have a point where Jesus could say constructive, good message, standard Jesus things, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Because in this movie's eyes, that's not the point. The point is you should feel bad because Jesus got beat because of you, you fucking dirty sinner.
And I know that while the torture that goes on in this film in regards to Jesus, it's fucking horrible. It's bad. I wouldn't wish this on any single one person. Not even really Coney. I don't think he's worth that amount of time personally, but you know what I'm saying. Like, I wouldn't wish that kind of thing on anyone. That in mind, that's not the worst beating or torture anyone's ever gone through.
No.
It's really bad. It's like an 8 or a 9, but there's 10s out there.
Like, have you seen those iron bowls that they used to put people
God,
in and
like
terrible.
Yeah.
Cook? And they cooked them alive? Seared them alive, I should say.
Yeah, much worse.
People have done terrible things to each other. Let's even say, like I would say a lot of people would probably prefer 12 hours of beating and crucifixion to, let's say, a lifetime of slavery. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Just
because it's a slow burn doesn't mean it doesn't burn at all.
Yeah, there's no objective model for suffering, but
right.
There have been people who have been hurt this bad, and people who have been hurt worse. And
so it's hard for me if your linchpin, your trump card is look how much that guy got beat. You're gonna have to do better than that. It's not like I want to see worse. It's not like even they claim he had worse. But then, if that's not the point should be Jesus was a good guy, and this is the point. Like he wanted this to happen for you. That's fine, but that's not the point. They're driving home. They're just driving home. Like, look, that hurt.
Side note: look at this creepy baby Satan's holding. Isn't that a creepy baby? Oh nope, it's a midget. Weird. And then you think, oh, the torture's probably over, right? Like, that was a long section of torture.
Right.
Nope, crown of thorns, and then they fucking put it on his head, and you know what's coming, but it's like, can we not have a breather before you stop doing... This movie, I'm telling you, you think we're exaggerating, 80% just suffering for the sake of suffering. It's awful.
And it would be way different, again, if there was any sort of message intertwined with it, and while you have the essence of a message that was probably there somewhere in the writer's room, they're like, we're going to make this movie 2 hours of suffering instead of 2.5 hours of a good movie.
Yeah. So Pilate presents this beaten up Jesus to everyone. They're just like, crucify him. And he's like, oh. And Pilate goes, okay, you can do what you want with him, but I wash my hands of this. And thus a colloquialism was born. But Pilate's just kind of like, do whatever you want. So they decide to crucify him.
And, of course, when they want to crucify him, they put him on this giant fucking redwood cross. This is not how crosses worked, especially not for just a random crucifixion that they happened upon during the day because the Jews were pissy. But you do see the historically accurate crosses that the two criminals that Jesus is put up with on their shoulders. And it's just the cross beam, and you can see it's got a cutout in the middle so you can stick it on the post. And this was how Roman crucifixion worked. They were very modular, so that you could crucify people and not have a permanent structure. You could just crucify them, pop them up. Instead, I assume it's Christians saying, no, Jesus was really important, even though no one defended him. By giving him a more permanent clearly more intense cross to carry, when really his crime was
lesser
of both. So it's just one of those things. You sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes you see historically accurate crosses in some art.
Yeah. Uppercase T.
Uppercase.
So yeah, he has to carry this giant cross through the city, and yes, I'm counting this as a torture scene, because it is.
Yeah.
And this sequence
Well,
lasts...
they hit him the whole time.
Oh yeah, this sequence lasts like another half an hour.
At least.
And it's like... And again, I know we said at the beginning this is a pretty good movie. It is. It's
shot... very well shot. Like, as far as the technical aspects of the film, very well shot. The narrative they draw is well thought out and well spoken, but I think the narrative itself is the flaw.
Yeah.
Because while the narrative works within itself, they could have expanded it in places and cut it in other places to make it a more well-rounded story.
It's just
and more effective message.
They were going for something different than we would go for.
Absolutely.
Then you get Romans knocking Jesus over for no fucking reason, as if the Romans didn't want to just get his ass to the hill and crucify him. Like, I get that, don't get me wrong, were some Roman soldiers assholes? Sure, a lot of people are assholes. But this ruined this whole city. Everyone in the city came to see these three dudes get crucified. Apparently. Presumably because it's Jesus.
That kind of shit happened all the time in places where Rome colonized and took over. Crucifixions were not rare, but the method to which Jesus is crucified and tortured the whole time, it doesn't fit the crime at all, and it doesn't ring true for Romans in the area at all.
And hey, look, Jesus gets whipped more, and he walks around. Welcome to my half an hour of watching this fucking movie. So as they're setting up the cross, we get one more quick glimpse of things the Bible says Jesus said. And we get the Sermon on the Mount, and it's very quick, and it's 15 seconds long, and he says essentially, hey, be good to people. Don't be an asshole. Give to charity. And that's all you get, and then back to fucking beating the shit out of Jesus, because that's clearly what it's about, right? That's what Jesus' thing was all about, getting beaten.
Again, as atheists, we shouldn't have that much of a problem with it, but they just don't send the good stuff out at all, to the point where even we, who don't really give a shit, are like, come on! He said some good shit. Like, let it happen. Come on, Mel Gibson.
So they put him up on the cross, and they nail him, and another point of historical inaccuracy. Often Jesus is portrayed as being nailed through the palms of his hands.
Yeah, which is very weird.
Actually, they nailed people through the wrists.
Right. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that before. And at least in this film, they show them, they stay tied with rope around their wrists, and then the nails are through their hands so they wouldn't have ripped out by sheer body weight, which is fine. But any crucifixion, it's all through the wrist. I don't know why they
always show hands. I think
it's just more striking imagery, in my opinion.
I think because we know that our hands are more sensitive, so in order to make it more horrifying, they do it through the hands in popular culture.
I mean, I prefer zero nails through any parts of me at all.
I agree. I'm just saying, if it's between, hey, we're gonna put a nail through your wrist and your hand, wrist every time.
Oh, and while they do that, they have to pop his arm out of the socket to make it reach and stuff, which is out of the Dolores passion. But...
By the way, I don't think I said anything about this. Can I just read to you guys real quick a passage from her manuscript, which was written in the 1800s?
I give you permission.
Okay, I'm going to read this. And can I just point out, to me, this sounds like she was writing a weird precursor to 50 Shades of Grey, so I'm going to read it as such.
Awesome.
Our loving Lord, the Son of God, true God and true man, writhed as a worm under the blows of these barbarians. His mild but deep groans might be heard from afar. They resounded through the air, forming a kind of touching accompaniment to the hissing of the instruments of torture. These groans resembled rather a touching cry of prayer and supplication, the moans of anguish. This bitch sounds like she was getting off on thinking all the fucked up shit they did to Jesus.
That's pretty great.
It's interesting, and again, she was Catholic, and as we said, Mel Gibson's Catholic. The Catholic, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the modern Catholic Church, but certain areas of the Catholic Church really, really like their crucifixion imagery.
They really do, and that's really where you get the bulk of your crucifixion imagery.
Yeah, it's a guilt thing, I think.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
And we're not saying all Catholics or even the modern Catholic Church. I think they've probably changed in the last couple of years.
The foundation and very fundamental Catholics.
So next to Jesus, as we said, there are two criminals. The one to the left of Jesus, if you're looking straight on at him, is like, hey, King of the Jews.
Fuck you, man. I'm an asshole. I'm like the bad part of these two.
If you were being crucified, I don't think taunting the guy next to you would be first on your to-do list.
Maybe he was just like that big of a douchebag.
Maybe. I wish I could be such a big douchebag.
He didn't have a faux hawk, though, so
No.
I don't know how that works.
He had a faux hawk in his heart. The faux hawk isn't on your head, it's inside.
And then the other guy is nice, is like, hey, listen, people, Jesus is praying for you. And this is the part where he's praying, forgive them. They don't really understand what they're doing. Just, please don't take it out on them. Which is a nice sentiment from a crazy person. And then, so the nice guy's like, yeah. And then so you have the narrative of the sinner and the saved.
Yeah, this is one of those things that also doesn't appear in the earlier Gospels, but shows up later. And any sort of literary critical analysis would tell you this is a story added later to have a message, which is essentially
absolutely.
Everyone in the world either falls into the asshole or the guy who realizes it's his fault and he's saved. It's just one of those things that's so clearly written. It's always interesting to me when people think that these are literal historical documents, which they are not, because you can look at literally a chapter before and see that it didn't appear until later, and it's so narrative driven.
Yeah, and if you follow our Bible study, which is the bulk of this channel, you'll know that we're not to the New Testament yet, but when we are to the New Testament, what we'll be doing is we'll be taking all the stories, including the Gospels. We'll probably do the Gospels all in one chunk, just because they're all pretty similar. And we'll be going in chronological order to show you how the myth evolves over time while it's written. And it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah. So the Pharisees taunt him and they say, hey, if you can, come down. Which again, as we mentioned earlier, yeah, he probably couldn't, because I think he was just a dude.
Yeah. Maybe a crazy dude.
And again, you would, if you're a Christian, probably say, well, he couldn't because he had to save everyone from their sins. Well, if he was truly omnipotent, he could have done it any way he wanted. He could have just forgiven people without the actual
He
suffering.
could have gone up there, let them do all that stuff, then come down, and then been like, see, I let you do this, and I'm not going to kill you or anything, but you're all forgiven for what you do as so long as you believe in me. That would have sent a much stronger message, in my opinion, for not just the people witnessing that immediately, but if you fucking see that, you don't write about this 40, 50 years later. You write about that today. Yeah. And you tell every goddamn person in Jerusalem during Passover, holy shit, look at this guy. That's amazing.
Yeah. And you, again, would probably say, well, you don't know what God wanted. God wanted it the way he wanted it because he's omnipotent and omniscient and he knows what's best. Well, that's kind of a cop-out answer because you're just assuming it's right, because if that's not true, then you're wrong. It's an appeal to consequences. Also, that's a non-falsifiable thing. Non-falsifiable claims are basically useless, so whatever. So Mary shows up and she kisses Jesus' gross feet. And I get it. I get it's an emotional moment again, but all I can think is, ooh, gross feet. And she's kissing them. It's weird.
Yeah. And then she's got blood on her lips. Then Jesus says, I have a thirst. And then Mary says, I don't anymore. No, she doesn't. She didn't say that.
Yeah, they give him a sponge, which according to the Bible is vinegary wine, whatever that means.
And then Jesus does the weird thing that we mentioned earlier.
This is, again, in multiple versions of the Gospels.
Absolutely, and it's also in the movie, and he looks up at the heavens and he goes, why have you forsaken me, God or Father or whatever? What, Jesus? Jesus, what? This is the plan, man. He has not forsaken you. A person who knows that he's going to end up in heaven, he's the king of all the things, he's also God and the Holy Spirit, is not forsaking. That's just the plan that you guys decided on, I guess.
And again, it brings up problems of the Trinity and what does it mean and who is Jesus? Is he the Father, Son, blah, blah, blah. And a theologian will say, well, he's all of them. The Father is the Son is the Father, and both are the Holy Spirit. That's not an answer. That's a non-answer. You're just saying things without meaning anything.
I don't even know what the Holy Spirit is. They mention it in passing.
It's what moves you to works of faith and all that jazz.
Dead?
Then the Holy Spirit thinks you're icky and doesn't do anything with you.
That makes sense, because I drool.
Jesus says the famous line, "It is finished," which, by the way, is only in, I believe, one version of the Gospels, and I believe it's John, which is the least reliable according to historians, and even theologian will often say, John it takes the most liberties. And then
the fact that he takes any liberties is bad.
Yeah, he takes a lot of them, though. And Jesus says, "It is finished," and he dies. Then there's like a weird shot that's an epic raindrop.
I don't get it.
It's weird. But anyway, raindrop, and then there's a huge earthquake, which splits the temple, which only one version, I believe, again, says it splits the whole temple. Definitely, the Bible says that it splits the temple sheet, like the thing. But in this version, it splits the whole temple in half, which, by the way, no one wrote about this happening. If this happened, someone would have written about it.
Just the Bible.
And don't say, well, the Bible wrote about it. The Gospels of the Bible were written at the earliest 40 years after the event.
Yeah.
It splits open, and they don't show this in the movie. But according to, it's either Matthew or Mark. I apologize, I forget. It's Matthew or Mark. It's only one of them. It says that the dead that were buried under the temple after it split came back to life and walked around the town, and tons of people saw this. Now, only one version of the Gospels mentions this aspect.
Yeah.
Which tells me
That's
that
nuts.
even the people who wrote about Jesus coming back from the dead said, we probably shouldn't write about that whole zombie people thing. That's really fucked up. No one's going to believe us. It's just interesting that it's only in one of the Gospels.
And it's not even John.
No, it's not. It's one of the earlier ones, which is so weird. And it claims that a bunch of people came back to life and walked around town, and there were witnesses.
Yeah.
That should get brought up more when we're talking
And
about
these
the
are
Bible.
considered miracles, by the way. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. Like, a miracle doesn't necessarily have to be a good thing. It just has to be an unexplained thing. And the second one that happens is, so they go up to Jesus, and he's about to hit him in the knees, and he's like, oh, he's dead already. And one of the Roman soldiers throws him a spear, and he's like, we'll check. And and stab him and see if he reacts. And if he doesn't, we'll knock his fucking knees, and he'll die, and we'll walk out. So he stabs him in the side, and then a little blood comes out, and then he sprays water.
I like that in this movie because it just sprays him like, you know the amount of blood loss? Jim Caviezel lost 7 people worth of blood in this movie.
So much.
And his blood pressure is so high when they stab him, it's like you popped a balloon. Look at it. It's crazy. It's awesome. Because they just had to get one more like crazy blood thing in. Interestingly, though, they show, as we said, the miracles and the crazy stuff, and the stuff split. And yet no one mentions it, and no other Jews in the area became Christians because of this, apparently.
Nope.
Whatever. They bring down Jesus in the most majestic way that Romans could possibly bring down a body. It looks like something like Leonardo DiCaprio would be drawing in Titanic. Yeah. And it ends on a shot of Mary holding her bloody dead son, Jesus. Or does it?
No, it doesn't.
We get a shot of the tomb, the stone rolling away, and then Jesus is
walking out with his Jim Caviezel booty. And that's how the movie ends, which is fine. That's fine where you end it. But again, once you wrap this up, it's just torture porn.
Just torture porn. Very well shot torture porn, though.
Extremely well shot torture porn.
And that's its saving grace. On the other hand, I would say that if you're going to make a movie about Christianity, you can do it well, and this movie could have done well. The problem is, this movie decided to focus on the wrong part of Christianity, and you might say, hey, you're an atheist, you have no right to say that. No, it's just an opinion.
There's redeeming factors for what Jesus said.
Yeah.
In the red letters in the Bible. He said, be good to people, help the poor, and don't be an asshole. Those are good things that I agree with.
I know, and as a Christian, who, if you like this movie and disagree with what we're saying, I would ask you, out of the message of Jesus, would you rather focus on the way he was brutally killed or the way you think he lived? Because isn't that the important part?
I thought so.
I thought that was the point.
Yeah, I don't get it. I mean, and for all intents and purposes, I would give this film like a 6.5.
I'd give it a 7. I think it's a
7.
What loses it is the focus, because I just don't like the content. Like if they had made a better movie about the life of Jesus.
If we're just going with technical filmmaking aspects, it's up there. It's a really, really well shot. Probably 8.5 if that's it. But as far as storytelling and how to evoke emotion and just overall package, 6.5 for me.
I think it loses some points too, just on the editing, and the layout of the movie is very early 2000s, and it shows.
I get it.
But I mean, I can't really blame it for that. It was made in like 2006 or 8 or something like that, so I get it.
Earlier.
It's not a great movie, but it's not a bad movie.
I'd watch it. I'd watch it if I hadn't seen it before, which I hadn't actually. This is the first time I had actually seen the whole thing. I'd seen parts here and there.
I've seen it before. It just seems like I never saw this when I was a Christian still, because I used to be. But it seems like if I were still a Christian, this isn't what I would want focus on.
No.
But hey, if that's your bag, that's your bag.
So, yeah, overall, pretty good movie, not the worst.
It just, the problems I have with the movie are often problems I have with the story of Jesus in general, which are the shittier bits and the crucifixion and the guilt aspect, which you're supposed to feel, and I don't, because I don't think it's true, necessarily. Since people might ask in the comments or comment on it, I'll say right now, I think a historical Jesus probably existed.
I think a version of this story happened,
probably,
but over time you just get this kind of this big fish story where it just gets worse and worse. And you can see that as you walk through the Gospels in chronological order to when they were written, not when they're presented in the Bible itself.
It's actually very close.
It's very close.
The only ones that are switched, I think, are the first two Gospels chronologically.
Yeah, but I'm sure there was one guy who had a decent following who got knocked off by the Romans and the Jews. It makes sense.
And I think, interestingly, through the Jesus story, you see how religions evolve in a very basic way. You have a guy who probably had some good ideas.
Sure.
And a cult of personality
forms
around them. As it goes, the establishment of that religion creates more things, more ideas that they want people to follow. Then they later attribute those things to him, and you see this.
Like, you'll see Paul take a lot of liberties in the New Testament after the fact as far as interpretation and what you should do while he's building his own church.
Yeah.
And it's very, very telling if you just read it.
Yeah. You're using this ideal Jesus to push and authoritize your agenda.
Right. And I think the issue is they read it in pockets and pieces instead of reading the whole thing as one text or one narrative, basically. If you just sit down and it's like, look at all these documents that are strewn out and read them in chronological order, you can see the myth evolve in front of your face.
Yeah. And that's not even including the non-canonical Gospels.
Oh, absolutely.
So, very interesting stuff. I'm glad you guys all came. I hope you enjoyed this. Mm-hmm. Suggest more movies in the comments because we're always looking for new ones. This was a very good one to do. I think people have suggested this, but this one we knew we were going to get to eventually anyway. So, thanks everyone. If you want, you can go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Bible Reloaded.
Or you can follow Hugo at Hugo Reloaded.
You can go ahead and donate to our Patreon.
You can also subscribe. There's a big red button in the middle you can click.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. Until next time, I'm Hugo.
And I'm Jake.
And this has been the Bible Reloaded.
Thanks, Jesus.
Thanks, Jesus.